past that proved of eternal significance.
Between the time Father Smith was born and Lucy Smith, his bride-to-be, the American Revolution began in Massachusetts. And with the American Revolution, the country changes from an agrarian economy to an industrialized kind of an economy. And for many people, that means opportunity and wealth and possibilities. And for the Smith family, that seems to always be the case. They're always on the verge of making it, and yet never quite getting there, one setback after another. And new freedom, strangely, produces not only liberation and opportunity, but also new anxieties. And the proliferation of churches with the American Revolution and the early years of the Republic can be seen as a manifestation of this. Ministers were concerned that as the frontier expanded, people would move away from churches, both geographically and spiritually. And as a result, new ministers and new methods were being tried, and it was a time of religious upheaval, great awakening. In fact, some historians call it a second great awakening.
Joseph Smith grew up during the greatest revival in the history of the world. He was living in a land of liberty. He was living in a land where there were more unchurched people than in any other Christian land. He was living in a land of multiple faiths. And the churches that grew during that period were the churches that solved the problem created by the Western expansion. These were the Methodists, the Baptists, and the Presbyterians. So large numbers of people were like Joseph Smith. They were concerned, they were converted, and they asked the question, which church should I join?
Lucy Mack Smith, Joseph's mother, wrote a history of her family, which is dominated by two major themes. It's clear that they were preoccupied with how they were going to get ahead, how they were going to pay their bills in this new economy that brought all kinds of hardships and challenges. And it's also clear that they were preoccupied with spirituality, how they were going to be saved, what church they should participate with, who had the true gospel as written in the New Testament. Joseph Smith, of course, comes of age. He becomes a young man. He grows from about 10 to 12 years of age while they live in Palmyra. And he says that it's about this time that his mind becomes seriously impressed on the subject of religion.
At about the age of 12 years, my mind became seriously impressed with regard to the all-important concerns for the welfare of my immortal soul. Being wrought up in my mind respecting the subject of religion and looking at the different systems, I knew not who was right or who was wrong, but I considered it of the first importance to me that I should be right in matters of such eternal consequences. My mind became exceedingly distressed, for I became convicted of my sins, and by searching the Scriptures I found that mankind did not come unto the Lord, but that they had apostatized from the true and living faith, and there was no society or denomination that built up on the gospel of Jesus Christ, as recorded in the New Testament. And I felt to mourn for my own sins, and for the sins of the world.
At the time Joseph Smith was involved in a quest to determine which church to join, he undoubtedly, along with others in the community, attended many camp meetings. Camp meetings were one of the techniques used by the ministers at that time to introduce the gospel that they understood to the people in the area. Some of these meetings lasted for days and days, even a week. Ministers would build a stage and stand on a stage. Ministers would stand on stumps, and they would preach day after day after day. And many people became excited about religion during these enthusiastic meetings.
Annually, the Methodist Church held conferences all over the United States and all over England, all over Canada. And one of these conferences was called the Genesee Conference. One of the presiding elders in that conference was George Lane. We don't know just when it was that Joseph Smith met with him under his tutelage, but we do know that he did. And William Smith said that George Lane, at some juncture, preached a sermon entitled, "Which Church Shall I Join?" or "What Church Shall I Join?" and used as his text James 1 and 5.
But he begins to read the Bible differently all of a sudden. And that is, he stops seeing it as it was seen by everybody else around him, for the most part, as a kind of an archive of God's dealings with mankind. And he started to see it as a book of examples, an invitation to receive his own revelation. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. And Joseph felt deeply impressed by that idea and determined to act it out for himself.
While I was laboring under the extreme difficulties caused by the contests of these parties of religionists, I was one day reading the Epistle of James, 1st chapter and 5th verse, which reads, "If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him." Never did any passage of Scripture come with more power to the heart of man than this did at this time to mine. It seemed to enter with great force into every feeling of my heart. I reflected on it again and again, knowing that if any person needed wisdom from God, I did. For how to act I did not know, and unless I could get more wisdom than I then had, I would never know. For the teachers of religion of the different sects understood the same passages of Scripture so differently as to destroy all confidence in settling the question by an appeal to the Bible.
Joseph tells us that on reading James 1 and 5, at least one of the times he had reflected on it, he went out into the woods to pray, though he had never prayed vocally in his life before.
That it was in the early spring of 1820 that he experienced the vision in the wilderness, or in the grove, or in the bush, as Oliver Cowdery called it. People have tried to determine through the climatology. They've tried to determine it even through the running of the sap and the sugar maple as to the freezing and so forth, and thawing and the running of the sugar maple. I think that we can only say that it's probably late March or early April as a possibility.
We do have references to Joseph leaving the home and going not far from the family dwelling into the woods. In one reference, it says that to a place where they had been felling trees the day before, where Joseph's axe was still stuck in a stump.
Joseph Smith immediately learned when he went into that grove that the power of evil is real and strong. But then he learned that the power of God is stronger. After Joseph arrived in the grove, he knelt down, and then he was startled. He heard a noise. He got up and he looked around, saw nothing. Again knelt in prayer, and then he was overcome by a power that just overcame him. He thought he was going to be destroyed.
Exerting all my powers to call upon God to deliver me out of the power of this enemy which had seized upon me, and at the very moment when I was ready to sink into despair and abandon myself to destruction, not to an imaginary ruin, but to the power of some actual being from the unseen world, who had such marvelous power as I had never before felt in any being. Just at this moment of great alarm, I saw a pillar of light exactly over my head, above the brightness of the sun, which descended gradually until it fell upon me. When the light rested upon me, I saw two personages, whose brightness and glory defy all description, standing above me in the air. One of them spake unto me, calling me by name, and said, pointing to the other, "This is my beloved Son. Hear him."